Good evening. It's my pleasure to be one of your hosts this evening. My name is Eric Owens. I'm the Associate Director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life. And as you all know, 1 year ago this week, Benedict XVI became the first pope in nearly 600 years to resign from the papacy. And his historic decision led to another historic decision, the election on March 13th of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the first Jesuit pope, the first pope from the global south, indeed the first of many things and many kinds. Pope Francis leads the global Roman Catholic Church at a time of great turmoil and great promise. And we are so pleased this evening to have 4 exceptional scholars to help us understand what lies ahead. Our panel this evening is co-sponsored by the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life and the Church in the 21st Century Center. And I want to thank the staffs at both places for all their hard work in making this happen. Both of our centers have a terrific schedule of panels, lectures, conferences, lunch events, etc. throughout the semester, and I hope you'll go to our websites to check out more information about them. And I'd like to give a special welcome to those watching us live on the internet this evening. Thank you to our friends at Front Row for making this happen. A video recording of this event will also be available at frontrow.bc.edu. Now, a few items of business before we get started. First, I ask that you silence your cell phones so that we're not interrupted during the course of our business today. But you don't have to put them away because we will be tweeting this event under the hashtag Francis Year 1, Francis Year and the number 1. And we also want you to know that you are encouraged to do the same. So follow along if you like, add your voice to the conversation. And then, as is our custom for these events, at the end of the conversation among our panelists, we will have a substantial amount of time for questions from the audience, questions from you. Here in the room, you can remain in your seat at that point and raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone to you. If you're watching online, you can tweet a question to us, again, using the hashtag FrancisYear1 in your tweet, or you can email us at publife, P-U-B-L-I-F-E, @bc.edu. And we'll have staff members watching the comments and raising those questions along with the others brought from the floor. And don't forget, if you're here in the room, you get a special bonus. You're able to take a selfie with the Pope himself after the evening has been completed. Now, with that, I'd like to turn over the floor to our moderator for this evening's panel, Professor Sean Copeland, Professor of Systematic Theology here at Boston College's Department of Theology. We've asked Professor Copeland to offer a few words of context about the Pope and this anniversary before she introduces the other panelists on the stage. So welcome, Professor Copeland.
Thank you very much, Eric. And thank you again to Eric Goldsmith for your work on this project, and special thanks to Alan Wolf, Director of the Boise Center. Without a doubt, Pope Francis has become the face of the moment. Little known outside Latin America, his election to the papacy of the Roman Catholic Church on March 13, 2013, catapulted him to global attention. His photograph has been published on the front pages of newspapers and the covers of magazines around the globe, including here in the US, there is Time magazine. There is also the New Yorker, a more whimsical depiction. Rolling Stone, which has garnered a lot of attention. And our own Boston Globe magazine, thank you very much. Our own Boston Globe magazine this Sunday spends a good deal of time discussing the Pope. So this interest, of course, by the popular media means that Francis has gained as much attention from the media as they gave in the late 1970s to John Paul II, the first non-Italian Pope to hold the papal office in 455 years. At the same time, the media frequently focuses on contrasts between Pope Francis and his immediate predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, the first pope, as Eric pointed out, to resign in 600 years. On the one hand, feminist theologian and social advocate Mary Hunt, in a post for the blog Huffington Post, interjects a note of restraint. Mere euphoria about the personality of the Pope distracts from his role and obfuscates concerns about structural reform. On the other hand, Cardinal Raymond Burke, in his column in L'Osservatore Romano, introduces a note of caution. Francis's shift in tone and words ought not to be twisted to suit self-interested ends. Critically informed, sympathetic, and balanced perspectives, then, are quite welcome. And our panel this evening shall attempt a robust conversation to illumine the 349 days of the pontificate of Pope Francis. You have the background of our panelists here in a handout, but just to recapitulate quickly, Professor Francesco Cesaro is president of Assumption College, Worcester, Massachusetts, and an expert in Renaissance history and Reformation history with regard to the papacy. Professor Cesaro is to my immediate left. In the middle, well, alphabetically, this is alphabetically, Professor Richard Gallardi is Joseph Professor of Catholic Systematic Theology in the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences here at Boston College, and the current president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. And Ms. Maria del Mar Munoz-Visoso is Executive Director of the Secretariat of Cultural Diversity in the Church for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in Washington, D.C. In my role as facilitator or moderator of the conversation, I'll ask each panelist an initial question just to get our conversation started, underway. At the same time, we can expect our experts to really engage one another, to talk with one another, and to raise other or concurring or differing points of view. And most importantly, to talk with one another about our church and our Pope. This by way of process, we will go at this conversation for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for questions which Eric will field. Welcome to you all this evening, and especially for those of you who traveled, especially Ms. Munoz, because you came a long distance, even though it's a short ride. Let me give my first question here to, or present the first question to Professor Cesaro. As a historian of the papacy, especially during the periods of the Renaissance and the Reformation, how would you place or contextualize the current papacy, still in its first and initial phases, in a kind of historical setting for us, to give us a kind of a bird's eye view of what's happened, and with a kind of a hint at prognostication, what might happen?
What might happen. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here this evening with you. You know, I think all of the attention that Pope Francis has received since his election, witnessed also by these publications that you indicated, have portrayed an image of a papacy that is unusual, very different from the past. And when you look at the historical context of the papacy, what we see here is what has been very natural and usual in the history of the papacy. As we transition from one pope to a new pope, it is not unusual that the approach of the new pope, the emphasis of the new pope is going to be very different from his predecessor. And that's often quite deliberate. And we can pinpoint in history times when a pope was elected because he was seen as different and perhaps moving the church in another direction as a response to the needs of the time. And we see this not only in the Renaissance period, but we see it especially in the modern period. You know, for example, when Pius IX was elected, he was elected because he was a great advocate of the nationalist movement in Italy, which the papacy had been very much against. And he was seen as someone who's going to embrace this nationalism and move the papacy in that direction with this process of Italian unification. We see then Leo XIII coming to the papacy, very different from Pius IX. Pius had his own evolution in the course of his very long pontificate. Leo XIII was seen as someone who was embracing the modern age and someone who was going to adapt the teachings of the church to that modern period. And we see this all along the spectrum of history with the papacy. So it's not very unusual that we have a different approach, a different emphasis in Pope Francis at this point in time, because we've seen that in the past. I think what we have to understand here is that the approach might be different, the emphasis might be different, but the substance is very much the same. And what I've noticed with Pope Francis, I say that in the beginning, I think he was a little bit uncomfortable with the position of Pope, and he embraced his position as Bishop of Rome because that was his comfort zone. And we're beginning to see him grow into the role of Pope. And as we see that, I think we're beginning to see much more continuity with his predecessors than at first we might have expected.
My great temptation is to leap right to our ecclesiologist, but I'm going to pick up on actually the Pope's cultural and geographic context, where he comes from, his Latin culture. And I'm going to ask you, Ms. Munoz, to reflect just a little bit on the impact of the Pope's origins on the whole tenor of diversity in the church. This is your expertise. And if you could say something about that, as well as maybe something about what that feels like for those of us who live in the United States in terms of our own efforts to bring out and to celebrate cultural diversity in the church.
Well, that question makes for a whole conference.
Exactly.
Of itself.
We've had one at least.
But I would probably highlight about three different points. One is he's definitely a product of, the church in Latin America. And I want to begin with something that not a lot of people have paid attention to, but is his childhood, his infancy. He attended a school called Escuela de la Misericordia, Colegio de la Misericordia, which is, the school of mercy. And that school was run by the nuns that were the daughters of las hijas de la Madre de Nuestra Señora de la Misericordia, the daughters of Our Lady of Mercy. So this topic of mercy that he keeps repeating and bringing back was very present to him from very early on. So I think the lesson here is don't underestimate the power of the nun. Particularly the Latin American nun, to drill in your mind and in your heart their very own charism. So I just wanted to bring that up because this is a recurring theme, but it's something that did not come later in life. It was present from very early on. The second thing that I want to bring up is he's also been very influenced by La Teología del Pueblo, the theology of the people. And the theology of the people was, developed in the 60s and early 70s, and it's kind of Argentina's own version of liberation theology, or theology of liberation. He has many of the key of the themes and the topics in common, but he has some significant differences. For example, it did not embrace the Marxist analysis of theology in the same way that liberation theology does. And number two, it does very much bring into the picture the popular religiosity and the sensus fidei and the popular expressions of faith as a way of evangelizing. And so I think that's very important that it's been present, and he's a product of that. And third, I think I want to bring to the picture, of course, Aparecida, because of his role, and we can talk a lot more about this, during the dialogue, but I just want to make sure that we put it out there, because several things. Number one, he's been picking on themes of Aparecida from day one. I was at St. Peter's Square when he came out to the balcony. I was there, for the first Angelus, and it started right there. He keeps bringing up, the issue of the option for the poor, but also, the missionary disciples, etc., etc. But it's not only on the topics. It's not only on the topics. It's also on the process. And he says that in Evangelium Gaudium. The process is as important or more important as places, and we can elaborate that. But what I'm saying is, this whole process of the Latin American Church of the See, Judge, Act that they follow in each one of the, CELAM conferences and in a lot of meetings in Latin America is very much present throughout. So I throw that out there. In terms of what that means for us here in the United States, I think it's really reinvigorated many Latino Catholics to begin with, because they have a pope they can identify with, and that they relate to. And so I think that they feel empowered to take whatever he's saying and advance, many of the things that they've been saying all along in terms of belonging in this church and helping build this church and coming to exercise leadership in this church. But I think, Francis is brought, that to the forefront and he's empowered them. It also means he's talked repeatedly about, number one, he was explaining the Catholicity of the church and why we're not all the same and we should not all be the same. And so he puts that, unity and diversity at the forefront. And he said as much and more even in the apostolic exhortation. So I think that what it means for us is we need to look at our identity as church in the United States. We're a church of many cultures, and there is no one way of being Catholic. There are many faces in God's house, and there is many expressions. Our faith is what united us, but there are many different ways of being Catholic and being a good Catholic. And so we need to rediscover finally the diversity already present in our midst. Because I don't know if you know this, but recent studies show that the shared parish or multicultural parish is the fastest growing model of church in the United States, to the point that nowadays 34% of parishes in the United States already celebrate masses in languages other than English, in addition to, obviously, but then also bring together communities of many languages and cultures. So that's something that is gonna give us something to think about right now. It's already doing that.
It's very helpful. It's a great start on this question, which we're going to come back to, I think, more than once. But I'm curious, since we talked about the past a little bit, I'm curious if Professor Gallardi might give us some thoughts as an ecclesiologist, a theologian who researches, studies, probes, and writes about the church. We know that other theologians, other ecclesiologists have really debated for some time now the approaches of both Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI toward the Second Vatican Council. Have you some idea, perhaps, of how you might characterize Pope Francis's approach to the Second Vatican Council, which still looms over us here some 50 years later?
Right. Thank you. It's a very good question, and thank you very much for your contributions initially. And my answer might be a way of adding the other side to the point that you're making, which I think is very valid. I mean, the papacy is a 2,000-year-old institution. So obviously there's a considerable continuity that's always going to be present in the papacy. And we would expect, for example, always a considerable continuity at the level of doctrine. And so when people make the kind of distinction that you legitimately made about style and substance, I think the point is valid to a certain extent. But the tendency, I think, is to think substance means doctrine. And from that point of view, certainly, are there expectations that Pope Francis is going to fundamentally change or revise the doctrine of the church? Not likely. But I think it's a mistake to limit substantial change to doctrinal change. So, for example, I think he has, in fact, made ecclesiologically some substantial changes vis-a-vis the Second Vatican Council. Now, it's interesting, he is the first of the last 5 popes who wasn't present at Vatican II. Of course, Pope Paul VI, John Paul I, and John Paul II were bishops at the council. Pope Benedict was a peritus at the council. Pope Francis wasn't. And yet there's a very real sense in which Pope Francis, as much as his 4 predecessors, is a pope of the council. And indeed, I would argue that he's offered a very fresh reception of the council. Now, to say fresh doesn't mean in contradiction, but it does mean, I believe, that he has foregrounded elements of Vatican II's teaching that did not receive as much attention before. And let me give you one example of this that I think is significant. In 1984 and 1985, we saw a significant turning point in the ecclesiastical reception of the Second Vatican Council. In 1984, the CDF issued 2 instructions on liberation theology that warned, first negatively and critically, of certain abuses, and then a more positive assessment. In 1984, Pope, then Cardinal Ratzinger, gave, of course, the famous Ratzinger interviews with the Italian journalist Vittorio Messori. And in those interviews in 1984, he criticized those who emphasized Vatican II's teaching on the church as people of God, arguing that that image of the church was subject to a sociological reduction. And he said, rather, we should focus on Vatican II's teaching on the church as communion. The next year, in 1985, Pope John Paul II calls an extraordinary synod on the reception of Vatican II. That synod deliberately moves away from the emphasis on church as people of God and says, no, in fact, communio is the central concept, the hermeneutical key for understanding Vatican II. A few years later, Pope John Paul II sort of baptizes that by quoting that line in his apostolic exhortation, Christi Fidelis Laici. And from the mid-1980s all the way through the end of Pope Benedict's pontificate, there has been a legitimate celebration of Vatican II, but interpreted through the lens of communio. Now, that's not an illegitimate understanding of the council. Clearly, that concept is in the council's teaching, but it's a theological concept, and I don't think it needed to be privileged at the expense of others. Pope Francis comes along, and what's striking is he says right up front his preferred image of the church is the church as people of God. Now, I don't think he's arguing that we have to do away with communio, but that opens the door to a very different way of receiving the council. It has consequences. When you focus on the church as communio, the tendency is to draw on, for example, a Eucharistic ecclesiology, as Pope Benedict so wonderfully did, and I think that adds a great deal to the church. When you focus on the church as people of God, the tendency is to privilege baptism. Now, it doesn't mean you exclude Eucharist, but Eucharist, for example, looks differently. If you focus on the church as communion, Eucharist tends to be, as it was for Pope Benedict, the preeminent symbol of the unity of the church. Therefore, it should not be shared indiscriminately with those who are not in doctrinal communion or those who are in a state of grave sin. If, on the other hand, you think of the Eucharist from the perspective of baptism in the people of God, you get the way Pope Francis talks about the Eucharist, where he says the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but a nourishment and medicine for the weak. A very different way of thinking about Eucharist. Now, I don't think they're opposed to one another, but I would argue that by shifting the lens for reading the Second Vatican Council, a very different constellation of teachings comes to the surface at the Council. This is not just style. This is a substantially new retrieval of the Council's teaching. And it has opened up a whole series of fresh opportunities to think about where the church can move forward.
So this kind of underscores, I think, your point about process. In other words, that it's not just what the Pope is pointing to, but there's a process here. So that you're picking up on, you're framing it in more theological terms, but this is the point, I think, that you're making earlier. That these, rather what we think of as homely sayings or engaging sayings, really are about inculcating some other new habits, you might say, in us, so that we have attention to process. But that doesn't count for, we don't want to lose continuity. This becomes one of our tensions, isn't it? I mean, the tension between tradition and charism, or continuity and discontinuity, and yet how do we move forward in some way?
Yeah, you know, and I think you're absolutely right. And my sense is that Francis has come to the realization that in the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, where you had this vision of the council, that foundation has been laid, that we've come to understand what that means, and now we need to add to that, to enrich that, this new emphasis. And there's where the continuity comes, but also the newness, a new way of speaking about the council, a new way of speaking about Eucharist, a new way of speaking about baptism that I think touches on his whole emphasis on mercy. You know, because I think mercy becomes the avenue by which he understands many, many things theologically, sacramentally, and therefore this image of the church. You know, I see, you know, where John Paul, I think, was do not be afraid, where Benedict was faith and reason, I think Francis will be the Pope of mercy, you know, and I think his motto reflects that, you know, so I think you see that there.
Mercy, I would say, in action.
In action.
Not as an intellectual category or a nice thought, but you know, you can see that he's a man of action, that he's a man of gestures. And, you know, and knows that those gestures, you know, touch people in a way that, you know, perhaps big theological, you know, reflections cannot. Simple people, your average people out there. And so I think he uses that. But most importantly, I think mercy in action means that he is asking the church to really immerse herself in a path of conversion so it can get ready for mission. And, you know, this is the whole idea, you know, to get the church going on missionary discipleship. The disciple knows it's not the master, it's following someone else, the teachings of someone else, and it's appropriated those teachings, and then it's in love with the master and is in love with those teachings, and then needs to go out and share those teachings and live them out. And so I just wanted to point out that, you know, mercy for him is a very tangible thing. And we go back to this Latin America theology and way of being, which is very incarnate. You know, we like to touch images. We talk to them. We talk to the saints. You know, we dress them and undress them. You know, it's very fascinating. You know, but it's a very incarnate reality. You saw when the Pope went to Brazil for World Day, and he insisted that he had to visit Aparecida. He just didn't. He did not only kneel down to pray in front of Our Lady of Aparecida. He then went up to the crystal, you know, and touched it. And then afterwards, the image was brought to him, and he kissed it. Because that's the way he needed to express the reverence for that particular advocation of Mary, which, by the way, is also very Marian, you know, in his devotion to Mary. So, you know, again, a very incarnate reality, a very, you know, we need to feel and touch and see and hear the Lord through his ministers.
So go ahead. No, go on.
No. Well, I very much agree with this. I think mercy is a striking element of his teaching. If I were to think of the Pope's slogan, though, I would say it's mercy and mission. Mm-hmm. The other thing that is very striking is his emphasis on mission. Yeah. So, for example, where for John Paul II and Pope Benedict, the language was new evangelization. The language for Pope Francis is missionary discipleship. Now, there are clear connection points. But it seems to me this goes back to the fresh reception of the council. I would argue that Pope Francis has taken to heart what the decree on the missionary activity of the church, Ad Gentes, says. The church is missionary in its very nature. And so it's mercy and action in the church's mission in the world. And so what's striking is Francis's emphasis over and over on the need for clergy and the church's ministers to get out of the rectories and chanceries and to go into the streets, to meet people where they are. And I would invite this, not again that I don't want to be the voice of discontinuity here, because the continuity is very real. But it is worth our reflecting on a certain way in which Francis thinks about what it means to engage the world. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Pope Benedict certainly did not want the church to withdraw from the world, but he tended to paint the church-world relation in very stark colors and used language that was at times almost apocalyptic, a culture of dictatorship, of relativism, and the dangers of secularism. It's hard to avoid recognizing that for Pope Francis, the language is of encounter, a culture of encounter, a dialogue of encounter. The church is a field hospital that has to deal with people where they are. So I think it's interesting, all of his predecessors would have emphasized mission. Paul VI wrote one of the most profound encyclicals on this, apostolic exhortations, Evangelii Nunciandi, and Pope John Paul II's encyclical on mission. It's very powerful. But this is a pope who's brought something, I think, distinctive about what the church's mission looks like. And it's a little more open, dialogical in its engagement with the world. And that gives us a little different focus.
And I think that is the door for Francis to reiterate some of the themes of continuity. In terms, for example, he has spoken about relativism and the problems of relativism and secularism. But his approach to it is precisely what you say. He gets into the midst of the world. He gets in the messiness of the world, which gives him the avenue to raise these issues, and maybe they're heard differently.
Yes.
I think both of you made an important point earlier on. I think the way in which he approaches and he answers questions. I'm a journalist by training, so I pay attention to how a question is it's asked and then is answered. And it's not that he dismisses, questions of doctrine, or when approached about, homosexual or, women's ordination, things like that, or issues that may be controversial. It's just, he just says, well, this matter has been settled. However, we need to consider this and this and this and that. So in a sense, it's just, I'm not making a big fuss of this. There is a settled teaching of the church that is there for everybody to see. Our prior pope put together the catechism of the Catholic Church for everybody to, to learn those sets of truth. They're there. So now, how do we live that out in the world? So I think that's, in that sense, I tend to agree with you. That really, he is saying, well, now how do we live these truths of faith in the modern world as it is changing and evolving? And I think that he really has this, I think, being the main drafter of the document of Aparecida again, gave him a privileged balcony. And he is also, I talked to the director of communications recently of Selam, and she was highlighting the way he was able to welcome input from everybody, from very, sometimes very different positions, but the way he was able to work in all of those insights, most of those insights, so in a way they all ended up being reflective of the discussions that had happened at the conference, at the 5th conference in Aparecida. So I think that he has this way of bringing opposites together and bringing different opinions. And you can see just that, in the dynamics that are going on these days at the Vatican. He brings perspectives from others from outside the Vatican. And he brings cardinals in, and he makes cardinals from, the most, hidden, parts of the world.
Yes,
and because he wants the least to be represented, as well as the ones who are used to, have a say in things. So I think that's important. And really, I think mission here is the key word. The missionary activity is not something external or additional. Is at the very core of who we are. The very, mission of the church is to evangelize. And so he says, so if your parish is not going out there and finding out who's in the neighborhood and bringing Jesus to them, it's not doing its job. So there you go, a very concrete application for what that means here to us in the United States.
Well, exactly.
Who lives in the neighborhood? Are you evangelizing them? They do have the right to hear Jesus. So I think that's his approach. Go, he told the youth, again, the Argentinian youth in Rio, quiero lío, go out there and make a mess. And he says, sorry, bishops, but, I want them to really stir things up and, and become missionaries. So I think that's the call that he's making to the entire church, from the bishop to, the person in the pews, to the ones who are not in the pews. Let's hear the gospel anew.
What do you think, and maybe this is redundant in some ways, but what do you think the Pope's most momentous challenge is right now? And if you don't want to make it so individual, maybe what do you think the most important challenge for the church is at this historical moment? In the sense you've told us about mission, and that's absolutely important, and that's in fact a continuous challenge to the church in every age, in every place, every time. But every time, as a historian knows, is also different.
Exactly.
So do you think there's something particular that's happening in our time? And it's hard to know to some extent, but you all have your hands and feet in differing places, and you meet up with differing people. Students, with lay people a lot in parishes, or with administrators, with bishops in particular, I'm sure you do. And you're meeting all sorts of people as a president of a college.
I think he wants to revitalize, make the church relevant, particularly to those who have been distanced for whatever reason. I think he sees it as a big challenge, which is different from Benedict in terms of his image of the field hospital, saying that, you know, we've got to get out there and we've got to welcome people and we've got to make them feel at home in the church, and we have to make the church alive again. And I think that's what gives hope to many people with this Pope, that here is an individual who wants to breathe new life into this church so that it has relevancy in this modern world, which we tended to lose a bit, particularly in the previous pontificate.
The field hospital image is really arresting, and I brought along that quote with myself, actually, he says to the editor of La Civiltà Cattolica, Antonio Spadaro, that I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. And he repeats this phrase, heal the wounds, heal the wounds. And you have to start from the ground up. That's his final comment here in this.
I would highlight two things that call my attention from reading a lot of and hearing a lot of his sayings in terms of what he thinks that the main challenges are. And I was rereading Evangelio Gaudium in Spanish. And by the way, if you speak Spanish, if you can read Spanish, I really recommend that you do, because I think I never had so much fun reading an apostolic exhortation before. He comes up with the most, you know, with these words that didn't exist. He just invents words, and then he explains what he means by that. But he also pushes the language a little bit to the limit and twists it. So he has many expressions that, you know, it's just like, oh my goodness, you know, this is, it's really funny sometimes to read them. But the two key themes that I think I would like to highlight are, number one, his preoccupation for the preferential option for the poor. I think he's seriously concerned that the current economy and the current state of affairs and the globalization, it's really making the the gap between the rich and the poor wider and wider and wider, and the masses of, you know, los desposeídos and los desechables. It means those you can, you know, do without and just, you know, treat like if they were, you know, a Kleenex or some, you know, a tissue or something.
Disposable people.
You know, they're disposable. They're not necessary. That, you know, and so I think that he's really seriously concerned that this society is leading to a place where people are no longer going to be treated like people, and are already millions and millions of people that are not being treated with the dignity of a human person. So I think that that's his number one, and it's only natural, not because of his personal trajectory, but also because of the commitment he made at the conclave. You know, when Cardinal Holmes was sitting right next to him and told him, "Don't forget the poor." And he promised that he wouldn't, and he said that at the very first public interview he had with the media. You know, but then the other theme that I think that he is also very concerned, well, along with the preferential also of the poor, is building, you know, a society where the common good is properly understood. You know, where the good of where everybody can advance, when everybody can be a person living with dignity. The other concern I think that is important is also the family. See, in the Latin American tradition, the family is the traditional catechist, the main principal transmitter of the faith. But how are you going to entrust to this family who keeps disintegrating the charge of catechesis and evangelizes and handing on the faith? So I think that he is thoroughly concerned about the health of the family, but really, as you were saying before, in a way in which we need to heal the wounds first. We need to we can't speak about the family should be this and this and this and should do this and this and that. But we really need to do what we can to make sure that we empower and we heal and we, prepare young people, to know what fatherhood and motherhood is and, and being together. So I think there is a genuine preoccupation in his mind for the well-being of the family as the cell of the church and the transmission of faith.
So this is the domestic church. So
yes,
here we are.
Yeah. Can I respond to your question?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So 2 challenges. One, I think he's well aware of. The other, I fear he may not be. So the first is, you mentioned the conclave. And in the days leading up to the conclave, I don't think there's any question that one of the reasons that he received considerable attention was that he had been quite outspoken about the need to reform the Curia. And of course, we had the Vatican leak scandals and so on and so forth. I think this is going to be a very big challenge for him. I think we're starting to see not just rhetoric, but action. This very week, we've seen the creation of a new dicastery that's going to deal with the financial situation. But we need to remember, as Professor knows very well, the Curia is a remarkably resilient institution that achieved its essentially modern form in 1588. And for 4 centuries, popes have been trying to reform it, and for 4 centuries, they have pretty much failed. Will he succeed where other popes have failed? I'm not sure. I think he's sincere in wanting to do that. But the bureaucratic pushback and the fact that we're not just talking about rearranging furniture, but the transformation of a deeply rooted culture makes that a peculiarly difficult institution to reform in more than a superficial way. So that's one real change, and I think the jury's still out on whether he can pull it off. The second challenge that I think he needs to face, but I'm not sure he's aware of, I want to be careful about this. I hold Pope Francis in very high regard, but I'm mindful of G.K. Chesterton's famous "The Fallacy of the Familiar." Pope Francis is great when he talks about dialogue with the poor, dialogue with people of other religions. He has this wonderful interview with an Italian atheist. Dialoguing with the other is one thing. Dialoguing with the people you think you already know is another thing. And I think there are many people who are concerned that, for example, when it comes to his discussion of women, this is where the fallacy of the familiar may come into play. I think he feels like he understands women, he knows women well, he's spoken a great deal about them. But I think there are a lot of women who feel like his articulation of their place in the church doesn't match their own experience. And so my hope for him is that he might extend the very many spheres of dialogue that he's encouraged to include listening to women from very different walks of life, from very different cultures, from very different theological perspectives. And I'm not sure he sees that as a challenge, but I think that's a significant challenge that his papacy, he needs to address in some way.
Can I just comment on the Curia issue? Because I think you're correct on that. How many popes have tried to reform the Curia? One of the difficulties, I think, is that the Curia's culture is not only an ecclesiastical culture, it reflects the Italian culture.
Right, that's right.
And the Italian culture is just as problematic, and the bureaucratic institutions of Italy are just as fraught with the intricacies that we associate with the Curia. And so that's going to be another difficulty. Does he understand that culture? I mean, he stayed away from Rome as much as he possibly could as a priest and as a bishop. And even though he's of Italian descent, does he really understand how entrenched and enmeshed the culture of the Curia is with the culture of Italy?
Right. No, it's a good point.
I would like to add to that even though he stayed away as much as he could, he has served in several pontifical councils, including the family, including the bishops and others. So he is aware of how things, work around there and who can be your allies and you're not so friendly, people there. I think that you're right that he's an outsider to the structure, but at the same time, he comes out of the conclave with a very specific mandate. It is, it is the way it is right now is not working. And, in fact, there was something very interesting that happened during the transition between the departure of Benedict and the actual conclave, during the general congregations, where you saw all of a sudden this block forming of some of the Western and North American bishops siding on the side of the global South bishops in asking for reform. And so there really was a big pressure. All of a sudden, I had to kind of chuckle when I saw some journalists asking questions about, how all of a sudden the North American bishops, particularly some of U.S. cardinals, had kind of become the voice of the disenfranchised. And you kind of, it makes you wonder. But all I want to say is, he's going to try. It's going to be very difficult because there's deeply entrenched, bureaucracies there. But he's certainly making his moves. The other thing that probably I think he has against him is time.
Well, that's right.
It's he was only 2 years younger than Benedict when he was elected. So. How many years we're going to have of Francis, how many years he's going to have to accomplish at least a portion of what he set out to do. That's the other question.
And the time issue is not just a factor with the Curia. The other thing that he's talked about a great deal is he wants a different kind of pastor, a different kind of bishop. He wants a shepherd with the smell of the sheep on them, and so on. But there's a real question about the extent to which he's going to be able to pull that off. Recently I saw the statistic, the average age of archbishops in the United States is 64. There's a long period of time he would have to continue before he can make a significant dent in remaking the episcopate in ways that reflect the different style of pastoral leadership that he has in mind. Is he going to be around long enough to make that kind of difference? I don't know.
The impact, though, seems to be strong on bishops and on clergy in this regard. I mean, people are doing things a little bit differently, so we read, in Rome than they have been doing them. There's a possibility that there will be some rub-off here, some transfer of interest. Yeah. We're gonna start wrapping up, but I'm very curious. One point that you brought up that was very, very interesting, which we hadn't touched on earlier, these emphasis on economics and the common good, and the family. And I'm also concerned about the issue of individuality. This is one of our issues here in the United States, especially. We tend to think of ourselves as individuals. I make my own achievements, my own successes. And there is something that we can learn, certainly we're always learning in this country from immigrant cultures. We're always learning, and we're all often brought to learn that at our own peril, or our refusal to. But I'm curious about this tension, because in a certain sense, that may not be the Pope's own personal tension, but how does he translate that for those of us who are here? How does he, bring that message forward that there is a good? In other words, you can argue with students that good is just simply relative, that there is no such thing as good. Certainly it's concrete, but there is something that holds us in what is goodness. How do you think we communicate that? I mean, you all, at least two of you are in education, and you certainly are in education in your very own way. You may not be seeing 25 undergraduates every day, risking your life, but in fact you are educating people on a daily basis, either writing, workshops, presentations that you give. And this seems to be something that's really a catch-up for us, and I'm just concerned here that this is this emphasis on mercy and so on also has a kind of personalistic, individualistic orientation, and we miss in some ways both large social structures, which are implicit in any concern about the economy and the common good.
Well, I think that
anybody can
Evangelii Gaudium, he is very specific about the way of engaging civic society, and about some of those concerns, I think that there is a sentence, I cannot remember exactly because I remember it in Spanish, but I don't know how it was translated. But, it's talking about freeing those individualists of their own chains, something like that. And what he's trying to say is when we focus too much on the self and self-accomplishments, then we take our gaze, away from the other. And we are a relational community. We are called to be a church in the image of the Trinity, And so we really need to live, our faith in community, but we need also to care about the well-being of the other. So I think that, he's saying that there is something good, about, striving to be your best and to do your best, and etc. But not lose, track of the other, because really we are, relational beings, and again we're called to care for the other, and he keeps reminding us that the way we will be judged is in how much, and how well we care for the other, especially for the poor, including evangelization of the poor. Because another sentence that is in Evangelii Gaudium is we cannot, I think that the worst thing is that people do not feel the friendship with Jesus, especially the poor, the benefits of being in relationship with Jesus, So I think that, he really is concerned that faith and life have to go together, that the cross has two woods.
Planks, yeah.
One that is, always a relationship with God, and that the evangelizer has to be a spiritual person that is deeply rooted in faith, but at the same time, someone that, like Jesus, extends its arms on the cross and embraces everybody in need and heals wounds and strives to make sure that everybody feels welcome in those arms of the cross. So that's the way I would phrase it. I don't know.
Yep. Well, we're going to open up for a wider conversation. And Eric is going to field questions and pick up on the tweets or emails.
Yes, right. So a reminder that if you're watching online, you can send a question to us via email at publife, P-U-B, like public, life, at bc.edu, or tweet at the hashtag FrancisYear1. But now we'll start here in the room with questions. Yes, ma'am. A microphone will come to you, so please wait until it arrives. And if you could, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jane. I'm over at the School of Theology and Ministry. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I had a question about Pope Francis's relationship with the media. I used to teach high school. I know how connected my students are with all kinds of media. And I've seen a lot of positive moves on Pope Francis's part to engage with that. I've also seen a lot of communication about Pope Francis in the media that's not necessarily mediated by him. We see the pictures of him on these different magazines and, many articles that may misinterpret what he said. I'm wondering if this is a new challenge or an intensified challenge right now. And I'm wondering what we can do catechetically to kind of deal with, there's so many people, I think, receiving messages about Pope Francis from sources other than, say, Evangelii Gaudium or even Pontifex. And so that's my question. Thank you.
Well, I actually think this part of the situation is not unique to Pope Francis. I think one of the big turning points for me, and as an expert in the history of the papacy, you could challenge me on this, but I think one of the big turning points came with Pope John Paul II, in the sense that he was, in a way, I think, the first media-savvy pope. In this regard, he understood the power of the symbolic gesture. I think when many of us think of John Paul II, there are images that come to mind there, and there were media images of him kissing. I mean, this is for you and for many of the students here, maybe before your time, but images of him kissing the ground. He was on a photo on the cover of Time magazine where he's with his would-be assassin in a cell, praying with him. Some of us remember his wagging his finger at Father Ernesto Cardenal in Nicaragua. He had a sense that gestures and images, in a way, teach us powerfully as an encyclical does. All right? Now, there was another side to him, but I think Pope Francis has picked that up in a way. Now, it has a problem because you've got all the media spin and they want to push their own particular narrative. But I think he's also recognized the power of the symbol gesture. This is where the style-substance thing, you see, breaks down, because to the extent that style is about symbol, I mean, in the Catholic tradition, the symbolic is really, really important. It's not just superficial. So when a pope decides, you know, that he's not going to wear an ermine mozzetta and red Prada shoes, or when he decides he's going to drive a Renault, or when he decides to get on a bus with other people, this isn't just style. This is, in fact, using the papacy to teach in a postmodern age, right? Now, it has a blowback problem. I mean, there's an element where you're vulnerable to what the media does. But I think this is there's no going back to this. And so the savvy pope, now the danger here, and Mary Hunt talks about this in her essay, the danger of this is sort of the papal spectacle kind of thing that can happen.
Yes.
And that is a danger, and I don't want to minimize that. But it's also an opportunity to think of a different style of teaching. To imagine a pope who teaches less by encyclicals that we read, but not a whole lot of other people, and instead teaches by the symbolic gesture, which I would argue is one of the most powerful ways in which Jesus himself taught.
The other thing I would say is that we need to help students and ourselves read more critically, to pick up the snarky tone, if you will, in an essay, or to highlight, you know, what might be inaccuracies, which then requires of us greater knowledge. And so I think that's one of the other dimensions, really the other dimensions of this. Yeah.
And I would say that, you know, for Francis, who as an archbishop stayed away from the media, suddenly is engaging the media. He's just talking off the cuff many times. And so what's important is he may not even have thought through the meaning of what he said. And then afterwards there has to be some, you know, wait a minute, this kind of thing. And so it gets to your point, you really have to go beyond sort of the superficial that is reported or given to us and look more closely at some of the other things that he's saying and that he's writing. I think that's important for the students to try to understand.
I would add to that I think that, you know, this Pope actually, in many ways, is great because talks in simple phrases, so he's very tweetable, all right? But however, he is also speaks sometimes in slang, and that means that it's difficult to translate into other languages. You know, those who speak Spanish even sometimes have a difficulty in understanding because sometimes it uses very Argentinian, you know, words that have a particular meaning, even though that word may exist in the, you know, in the Spanish language in general. So you have that difficulty on the one hand. On the other hand, you also have a pope that it's made available anything he says in a way that no pope has done before. Because, you know, this fact that his homilies off the cuff in the morning, every day, are available to anybody who wants to listen to them, offers anybody a great opportunity to listen to the Pope unmediated, all right? But I would emphasize the importance of contrasting information, because often what you will hear from regular media, and even from Catholic media, that may side, you know, in different camps and have different views, you know, it has some interest vested in it, or in what they highlight about the Pope, or a quote of him is put out of context, which is very easy to do. So always contrasting information, being critical, but you know, follow him, let him, you know, get acquainted with him in his own words, because that's going to be the best way to try to understand. And then what we say in intercultural competencies is, you know, you need to approach anything you want to know with knowledge, attitudes, and skills. By that I mean you acquire certain knowledge about the person you're trying to learn about. You have an open mind, and you know that things can mean more than one thing depending on the context, you know, and then you acquire over time a certain flexibility and a certain skills to get to understand what he's saying, you know, and when he's saying it. So I'm just saying you need to develop a certain gymnastics here in order to get to, really understand the Pope and help others, understand what he's saying. And we all read anything that we read, but particularly the Pope, with our own lenses. So becoming aware of our own biases and our own lenses is also important.
Rick, you had one thing to add?
Yeah, though well, just real quickly,
Briefly,
it relates to this, my contention that what we're seeing here is a different style of papacy, and I don't want us to miss the significance of it. Going back to, the 16th century, I think, with St. Robert Bellarmine, there was a fairly traditional distinction in Catholic teaching on the papacy, that the Pope teaches formally as universal pastor, but he could also speak as a doctor or a theologian. And when he speaks as a theologian, he has no special authority. Right? This is a long-standing distinction. And it was carried forward like with Pope Benedict, who would issue formal documents. Then he would write his books on Jesus of Nazareth, and he made it very clear he's writing as a theologian. Mm-hmm. But I think Francis is in a way challenging that. The temptation is to say, is the Pope being an official teacher or private theologian? And so the temptation is to look at things like these interviews on the plane and say, oh, well, that's just the Pope being a private theologian, and that doesn't really count. Whereas I wonder whether what we're seeing, in fact, is a different style of magisterium. We think magisterium means formal, binding, juridical documents. But what if he begins to suggest that magisterium, which ultimately means simply the authority of the teacher, is a different style of teaching? What if he's modeling a kind of teaching in the form of conversation, that's informal, that's back and forth, that's open to revision and change, where he's giving interviews not as a private theologian? This is a new style, maybe, of papal teaching, one that we're not accustomed to.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you very much. We have a question here. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Joan Kingsland. I'm a professor of moral theology at Monte Ecclesiae College in Greenville, Rhode Island. And my question is about that fact that we have a pope now who's the first Jesuit pope, and I'd be interested in hearing your point of view of how he, as a Jesuit, what he has to bring to the church right now in this society, and thinking especially of how the Jesuits stand out for their discernment. The whole Ignatian discernment, and how he can bring that, or how he's bringing that into his papacy.
Yeah.
I don't want to dominate, so no. Go ahead.
Well, I think that whole concept of discernment is very important to Francis. And he alluded to it in some, I don't know if it was an interview or something, yeah, but how he doesn't trust his first decision in his head before he actually makes a decision. He needs the time to sit back, to reflect, to think, to bring together all of the different views and perspectives before he can trust himself that this is the right decision to make. And I think that's discernment right there. So he's very much bringing his whole Ignatian spirituality to the way in which he governs. And I think we'll see more and more of that in his papacy. I think it's part of who he is.
As a member of a religious order, I mean, there's a whole backdrop. There's a whole storehouse, really, of accumulated wisdom and practices, skills, disciplines, in which and through which he's been formed as a person, as a man, as a priest. And he himself identifies his own weaknesses, his own needs for improvement, and so on, that perhaps he hasn't made always the very best decisions, but realizes that you make decisions as you must. The other thing is to pay attention to the various general councils of the Jesuits through which he's, whether he's been there or not as a representative, but those documents come home to people. And religious have different ways of dealing with those documents. Sometimes they're on the shelf and sometimes they're in your hand. But I think that there is some hope, particularly with regard to, I'm being very optimistic here, with regard to women. since the Jesuits made a commitment to partner with women in their ministries and to be alert to women in their ministries. So I think this, not only discernment, but I think the whole storehouse of a religious community is part of his formation. I mean, this may very well be why it is not difficult for him in a certain way, although he's living as a bishop all these many years. But the simplicity of life, the willingness to let go of a number of things, the rescaling of your whole spiritual life in a religious community is very different. Unfortunately, this is not a denigration of diocesan priests, but sometimes the supports and the corrections and the community and the contact just aren't there, And these men, to their credit, work very hard to bring together what is more or less easily available to people in religious communities. So clearly his background, his formation, the long period of Jesuit formation actually, which is over 10 years, really, I think we should count on that to come to the fore for him. I really do. I mean, I don't know that, it's very hard. I mean, this is an old man too. He's not 50. John Paul II was 58 when he was elected. That was a very young man by today's standards in terms of the Curia and the papacy. But I think this also should give us some comfort about someone who has some wisdom of his own through experience and through trial and suffering.
I know we have a number of questions on the internet as well. Let's move to one of those. Do one of you have one? Yeah.
This next question comes to us from Peter from BC School of Theology. And Peter writes, Francis undoubtedly favors a church of and for the poor, rather than of and for the wealthy. He also seems committed to the church's traditional teachings about sexuality, or at least hopes to downplay them in favor of proclaiming the good news of the gospel. If condoms do in fact reduce poverty, and if, for example, they can provide immediate help in Africa where HIV/AIDS devastates so many, how do you envision Francis will negotiate the tension between his desire for a poor church with his commitment to traditional teachings against contraception, especially given that he hails from the global south? Is this assessment of Francis fair? And if so, does this problem pose more of a challenge or an opportunity for Francis' papacy? Do you foresee Francis's vision of mercy leading to a softening of the church's stance on contraception?
I don't think that came from Twitter.
Email.
Not. I think we probably should wait until the next plane interview for him to answer that question. But
Any takers?
Yes. I actually wanted to respond to the prior question.
Can we take one on this, though? Rick,
sure.
Are you willing to wade in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the questioner raised a huge set of questions there. I mean, first of all, I thought I understood a question. The question sort of morphed a little. It started out as about condoms with regard to HIV/AIDS. Did I not hear that? And then it went to contraception. And I would point out that there are moral theologians who want to argue that when condoms are used as a prevention for HIV/AIDS, they're not actually being used primarily for contraception. And so there are a number of moral theologians, indeed respected moral theologians here at our institution, who would argue it's important to make that distinction. And there were hints even in the pontificate of Pope Francis's predecessor of some openness on this particular question. So I don't think in principle, in terms of the question, particularly as it's been raised in Africa, about the use of condoms, that Pope Francis necessarily, I don't think he's spoken on this as far as I know, but I don't think there's any reason to think he wouldn't be open to considering that question. He comes from Latin America, he does not come from Africa. As far as I know at this point, how much he's engaged the particular questions that are going on in the church in Africa is a whole other question. As regards whether he's going to change the church's teaching on contraception, which is a different question from the use of condoms for HIV/AIDS prevention, I think it's just idle speculation to know whether he's going to address that kind of question right now. Other than that, I don't know that I have a whole lot to say on it.
That's okay. We're drawing on in our time, so let's keep moving. Yes, ma'am. Question here, and then we'll go here.
Ann Donnelly, I'm on the advisory board of the STM. this is sort of a related question in part because I wanted to ask your thoughts about his commitment to synodality, to the synod process. And it seemed to be under the previous papacies, the bishops would come to Rome for their ad limina visit, and they were supposed to be listened to, but they were all often talked to. And there wasn't a perceived commitment to, often the synod documents were almost drafted before the synod actually occurred. And so now he has Cardinal Baldassare preparing the Synod on the Family in October. And as you read online, the beginning of various cardinals and bishops have different degrees of how much they want to consult the laity on their stances on reception, on contraception, on same-sex relationships, homosexuality. It's quite interesting to see the diversity of responses they're getting.
Yes.
And so what is your perspective about how the church will handle unity and diversity, the process of listening, the synod process, and what might happen if you're going to have a great variety of opinions, and who will be allowed to participate in that synod?
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm chomping at the bit, but I spoke
ahead.
before, so please go ahead.
Go ahead.
All yours.
Well, I mean, my heart leapt within me when, when I heard this, because I have great hopes for him. You know, there are not on this score. There are a number of things to point out. It's not insignificant. First of all, he has more experience as the bishop of a local church than any pope since Pope Pius X. All right, and that's not insignificant. The second thing is he has a profound and intimate experience of working with Episcopal conferences through Salem, in which he was very much involved. And it's interesting that when he went down this last summer to speak to the coordinating committee of Salem, he made a point of talking about how at a parecida they didn't start with documents, they started with people's experience and listening and sharing their faith stories and experiences. I think this notion of synodality is an issue very dear to his heart. And he's brought it up on a number of occasions. He brought it up in Evangelii Gaudium when he said the papacy itself has to undergo a conversion and recognize the Pope doesn't have to answer every question, that a lot of these can be answered at a more regional level. He talks about the need to recover the doctrinal teaching authority of Episcopal conferences. And I should point out, he does something very dramatic in Evangelii Gaudium. Namely, he says the doctrinal teaching authority of Episcopal conferences has not been adequately developed, and he footnotes Apostolos Suos, in which John Paul II essentially undercut the teaching authority of bishops' conferences, which was a pretty direct distancing of the position of a predecessor. I think one of the things I'm fairly confident that we're going to see with him is a recovery of the ecclesiological application of subsidiarity, where more and more decisions can be made at lower levels of church life, at the provincial level, at the level of Episcopal conferences. And I'm reasonably optimistic that he's going to transform over time the use of synods so that it's not sort of a showcase, but a genuine opportunity for consultation. And the questionnaire is, I think, a very promising beginning. Now, what I really like him to do is also to dramatically reimagine membership and participation at that synod. I'm less confident that's going to happen in the short term, but one can hope.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, one in the back. And then we'll go to this gentleman afterwards. Okay. Oh, she did. Okay, good. Karen, go ahead. Father Helmick.
You don't have to get up, Father.
Oh, please, yeah,
Sure,
you can sit.
I'm Ray Helmick. I teach in the theology department. I wanted to hear a comment. We have heard so much from Pope Francis about clericalism as a kind of cancer of the church, something that is really at the heart of most of his questions of style.
Well, he certainly has been concerned with the whole careerism and really trying to make priests and bishops understand that their role is not to be looking for their next major assignment or promotion, but to look at their role as a servant of the people. I think this is reflective of the fact that he's coming from a religious order. He's not a diocesan priest. The fact that he has, in order to become a Monsignor now, you have to wait till you're 65. I think it's combination of this concern for careerism and clericalism that is not healthy for the church, but also his experience as being a member of a religious community as opposed to being a diocesan priest.
You recall, of course, Lonergan's phrase, the shabby shell. I mean, that's really church careerism, and it's not the real church. It's just a kind of shabby shell that sometimes we find ourselves caught up in. And so I think it's a very, very thoughtful and serious move on his part to take the risk to make that kind of criticism. Because in a certain sense, religious order or not, he's implicated in it. And I think that's also teaching us something about not being afraid of self-criticism.
Ms. Munoz?
I just wanted to bring up the whole concept of servant leadership.
Yes.
I think it goes hand in hand with missionary discipleship,
Yes.
Or missionary disciples. And it's, the fact that he sees way too many people worried about their careers, and not, too many people, particularly in the clergy, worried about how can I serve the people of God better. And he very clearly says that begins with, smelling like sheep. You're a pastor, you're a shepherd, you know your flock, you live among them. And he said of himself when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, my people is poor, so I'm one with my people, and therefore I choose to live a life, that most of my people are living. And so I think that this whole concept of servant leadership, where the fact that I have a particular role and function in the church doesn't mean that I'm above you or more than you or I'm always right, but I have to. And he even in the exhortation, he even asks priests to meet with the laity to prepare their homilies, to bring their concerns into account. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think it's a concept that he's going to explore more, but he keeps referring to it, servant leadership.
And I think the other part I would say to that, though, is that it's also a change for him. I mean, there is his own growth and development in these areas. It's not as if he's been some automatic, perfect person. And I think that in itself is encouraging. That in itself is encouraging. That in itself is a teaching for us about change. We've had the same teaching from Archbishop Romero. I mean, there are changes that can happen in people who become open to be really disciples. So I think that's really, it's important.
And I think it's more substance than just style. He really believes in the power of consultation. Yes. So this whole issue of collegiality and synodality, it's very important because, he was part of a group of bishops that was very unhappy with the way this, several of the last synods, particularly the one on the new evangelization, was conducted. And part of that is the reason why he didn't call the apostolic exhortation post-synodal, because he thought it was too structured and there was not real room for dialogue. So now he invites this other group of bishops and cardinals to Rome to speak about the reform of the Curia, and after an initial presentation, it's just open dialogue. It's just, what do you think? What do we need to do? What's the best way to proceed? And just hear. So I think that he really believes in a different way of living.
Rick?
Yeah, I mean, I have loved almost all of what Pope Francis has said in decrying, the evil of clericalism, and he's put his money where his mouth is in a lot of ways by getting rid of the appointment of monsignors in most situations and so on and so forth. But I have to sort of raise one problem. In the midst of all the wonderful things he said about clericalism, there is the one puzzler, which is to say, when briefly earlier this year there was the floating of the idea of women as cardinals, he immediately kind of pounced on that and said, oh, this is a problem. The idea that people would want women to be cardinals represents a new form of clericalism. Now, all the gains that were made sort of get undone, particularly when one considers that there is nothing that requires for doctrinally cardinals to be ordained ministers. In fact, we have in our tradition lay people who are cardinals, and according to the Code of Canon Law, the two principal responsibilities of a cardinal are A, to advise the Pope, and B, to elect him. Now, there's no reason why only ordained people should be able to advise him. In many ways, he's open to listening to other people. And secondly, there's an ancient tradition of the lay people being involved in the election of bishops, including the Bishop of Rome. So while I'm with him on many of the things that he said about clericalism, when all of a sudden he says women being cardinals is clericalist, now I find myself going, now wait a minute, what does he mean by clericalism? So I just need to raise that as a bit of a concern.
We just have a couple minutes, and I'll take a last question then from its briefest form from Twitter, from Connor Kelly, who's sitting on his couch somewhere at Boston College, I'm sure. He tweets, is Francis going to reframe the language of new evangelization or steer away from it altogether?
Well, let me bring something again from Latin America. In the first probably the first 3-4 months, it took him really 3 or 4 months to use the words new and evangelization together. He kept talking about evangelization, the need to evangelize, etc. And I just think that he sees this from a Latin American perspective. And Latin America, throughout from 1983, 85, in Haiti, where the term is coined, I think John Paul II used it even before in Poland, but that's when the term really comes to to be made famous for the first time and then takes on. The different Salem Conference have been talking about the new evangelization for years. So when does the new evangelization stop being new? So I think he's now used to talk about evangelization in a way that is just the existence of the church, the mode of being of the church, and the mission of the church. And so in that sense, I will respond to that question that the new evangelization is new in many ways in many countries or in many parts of the world, and certainly the Western culture in Europe needs a new evangelization. Certainly many of our environments here in the United States and in Latin America need to hear the gospel anew. So in that sense, it will be a new evangelization. But, he is not married to the term as a definite, term to be used now. He just speaks of evangelization most of the time. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all. I've learned so much tonight, and I'm sure that all of you have as well. Please join me in thanking our terrific panelists.